They thought Elijah Cross was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. A roadside pull-off near the Grand Canyon, a trunk popped open, a camera bag in hand, a mother stretching her legs under the vast desert sky. They saw suspicion, they saw a threat. How could they miss the truth? They didn't see the decorated Delta Force commander, a man who'd carried the weight of loss, burying more brothers in arms than they could ever fathom. When they shouted their commands, Elijah stayed calm, his heart steady as stone. When they aimed their guns, his mother Miriam raised her camera, capturing the world's beauty in a single frame. But when they fired, she fell, her life stolen in an instant. They thought the story ended there, that the dust would settle and the truth would fade. Oh, how wrong they were. They didn't realize who they'd left standing, a man forged in fire, ready to unleash a storm for justice. The sun spilled over the horizon in long golden sheets, painting the desert in a warm radiant glow as the black SUV cruised down Highway 89, its tires humming a soothing rhythm that echoed the peace inside. The world stretched wide here, endless desert plains dotted with rust-colored rock formations, the sky so vast it seemed to cradle time itself, slowing it down, inviting you to breathe deeply. Inside, Elijah Cross sat behind the wheel, one hand resting casually at 12 o'clock, the other tapping lightly against the steering wheel, keeping time with a soft jazz tune drifting from the speakers, its mellow notes wrapping the cabin in calm. Beside him, in the passenger seat, his mother, Miriam Cross, tilted her head, letting the breeze from a half-open window caress her face, her silver curls dancing in the wind, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses that gave her a timeless grace. A camera rested on her lap, an old heavy one, full of soul, not like the sleek soulless devices most carried today. That camera had captured decades of joy, weddings, graduations, lazy Sunday picnics under oak trees. Today, it was poised for something extraordinary. 70 deserved more than just cake, it deserved the Grand Canyon's majesty. You sure you don't want to stop for pie in Flagstaff, Elijah? Miriam asked, her voice half teasing, half serious, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, warm and familiar. Elijah smirked, a spark of mischief in his eyes. We've had pie in Flagstaff, Ma. Remember that diner where the waitress thought I was your bodyguard? Couldn't believe I was your son. Miriam chuckled softly, shaking her head, her laughter like a melody that filled the car. She said you looked too serious to be related. I was serious, she was about to shortchange us. Her laugh rang out again, warm and full, a sound that wrapped Elijah's heart in comfort. He glanced at her, really looked, taking in the graceful lines of her face. She was aging, but oh so beautifully, like the long-limbed trees they'd passed in Sedona, standing tall with dignity, her spirit as light as the desert breeze. This trip was her dream, wasn't it? A birthday wish whispered over breakfast months ago, her voice soft with longing. I want to see the earth open up at the edge, Elijah. I want to stand somewhere that makes me feel small in a good way. Now, just a few miles from the Grand Canyon's quieter east rim, they were so close to making that wish come true. The road narrowed as they turned onto a pull-off near Desert Viewpoint, a hidden gem Elijah loved for its solitude, less noise, more sky, a place where the world felt pure. The SUV rolled onto a gravel patch, crunching softly, and he shifted into park. Stepping out, Elijah stretched, his lean frame unfolding in the sunlight, his fitted gray t-shirt and cargo pants accentuating his clean-cut precision, every movement sharp, controlled, years of Delta Force muscle memory etched into his bones, no matter how far he'd stepped from command. Miriam eased out more slowly, groaning as her joints protested, but her spirit was undaunted. Elijah hurried around to offer his arm, his protective instincts kicking in, but she waved him off with a playful grin. I've got it, soldier. Let an old woman feel the ground under her feet. He nodded, his eyes soft with quiet care, watching as she raised her camera, snapping shots of the horizon, the vast canyon lip shimmering in the distance, even the humble scrub brush at her feet. She saw beauty where others saw nothing, didn't she always? Elijah walked to the rear of the SUV, popping the trunk to grab her backpack, his movements smooth, practiced. A shadow flickered along the ridge, catching his eye. His gaze shifted subtly, instincts flaring. There, up by the main trail, a white park ranger stood beside his patrol truck, one hand on his belt, the other loosely gripping a radio mic. He wasn't admiring the canyon's grandeur, he was staring at them. Not glaring, not smiling, just watching, his posture stiff, unsettling. Elijah kept his stance casual, grabbing the bag, closing the trunk with a gentle thud, and walking back to his mother, but his senses were on high alert.
Everything okay?
Miriam asked, lowering her camera, her voice tinged with concern. He gave a small nod, masking his unease.
Juste arrangé up on the trail.
She followed his gaze, her brow furrowing slightly. Maybe he's enjoying the view. Maybe. But the air shifted then, a subtle but undeniable change, like a storm gathering on the horizon. A low rumble in the distance signaled another vehicle approaching, tires crunching on gravel, slow and deliberate. Elijah turned his head just enough to glimpse a tan state trooper cruiser easing toward the entrance. It didn't pull in, it waited, engine idling, a predator biding its time. Miriam noticed it too, her voice dropping, barely above a whisper. You feel that, Elijah? He nodded once, his jaw tightening. Yeah. A pause, the sagebrush rustling in the breeze, whispering secrets. Let's not stay too long, she said gently, her eyes searching his. Got more miles to go, right? Elijah offered a faint smile, his heart heavy, and looked up at the sky. The sun was still generous, bathing them in light, but the day had taken a breath and held it, a moment of stillness that felt like a warning. Elijah stood by the open trunk, adjusting the camera bag strap with care, when a distant snap of radio static shattered the quiet rhythm of the canyon wind. The sound was faint, easily ignored by most, just a hum beneath the endless sky, but to Elijah, it was a spark in a powder keg. His instincts, honed by years of Delta Force service, didn't just hear the noise, they caught the clipped urgency woven into it, a signal of trouble brewing. He didn't need to turn around, he knew the ranger was reporting him. Up on the ridge, Ranger Todd Ellison leaned against his patrol truck, one hand resting on his belt, the other clutching the radio mic, his eyes locked on Elijah and Miriam below. He didn't call out, didn't wave, didn't offer a hint of friendliness, just watched, his gaze narrowed, his posture rigid, out of place in this peaceful overlook where a mother and son had stopped to savor the view. Why was he so tense? Ellison's mind had already spun a story, hadn't it? A black man at the back of a vehicle, too new, too spotless, too expensive to belong to him, in his eyes. To Ellison, Elijah's presence here screamed suspicion, not a man on a road trip with his mother. Dispatch, Ellison muttered into his radio, his voice low but certain. I've got a suspicious subject at Desert View pull-off, possible 10 to 62, looks like he's trying to break into a vehicle. Male, black, mid-40s, military cut, dark shirt, and cargo pants, standing at the rear of a black SUV. Requesting local unit support, just in case. The reply crackled back, a confirmation that sealed his judgment. That was all he needed. He stayed put, silent, watching from above like a vulture circling prey. Down below, Elijah lifted his head as the radio's last word reached his ears, catching Miriam's glance as she turned from the canyon's edge. Her face, moments ago lit with joy, now held something else, quiet, alert, a shadow of recognition that broke Elijah's heart. It wasn't fear, not yet, but the weary awareness of a woman who'd learned to sense trouble long before it showed its face. How many times had she felt this? Elijah, she called gently, her voice steady, unshaken, did you get the extra lens? He held up the bag, nodding, his eyes searching hers. Got it. She started walking back across the gravel lot, her smile fading, her steps more deliberate, a mother's instinct to protect her son kicking in. A low mechanical growl cut through the breeze, tires chewing gravel with slow, menacing precision. Elijah turned just enough to see the white state trooper cruiser rolling in, followed closely by a sheriff's SUV, their presence heavy. The doors didn't open immediately. The three men inside waited, sizing up the scene, piecing together whatever story the radio had fed them. Then, in eerie unison, they stepped out, moving with synchronized purpose. No words, no greetings, no pause. This wasn't a friendly check-in. It was the march of men braced for confrontation, their boots crunching gravel like a war drum. The state trooper in front, Latimer, strode with squared shoulders, heavy steps, his mirrored sunglasses hiding his eyes, his mouth a tight, unsmiling line. Behind him, a younger, thinner man, Cody Moss, lingered near the SUV's edge, his eyes uncertain, his jaw tense, glancing between Elijah and the horizon as if waiting for someone to tell him what to think. Bringing up the rear was Ray Clean, stockier, older, his face already set with hard conclusions, his arms stiff, boots biting the gravel with every step. Elijah stood still, hands visible, posture calm, but his mind was racing. He didn't need to move, he knew what was coming. Yet, as always, he held onto a sliver of hope, ready to give them the benefit of the doubt. Could they see reason? Afternoon, Latimer said, his voice not a greeting but a declaration, cold and commanding. We received a report about a suspicious subject near a vehicle, said someone was possibly attempting to break in. Elijah kept his tone even, no hint of defensiveness. This is my vehicle, he said clearly, calmly.
Oui, juste travelling through.
The officers ignored him, their faces unyielding.
L'attime précédent, I need you tout présent identification.
Elijah didn't flinch, raising his hand slightly, palms open, fingers spread. Of course, sir. My wallet's in my front pocket. I'm going to reach for it slowly. Before he could move, Clean surged forward, his voice sharp, aggressive. Not yet.
Keep your en règle d'air.
Miriam reached Elijah's side, standing close, her hand brushing his elbow, not out of fear but to reassure, to anchor him. Her composure was fraying, but her strength shone through, her voice warm yet firm, wrapped in steel. Officers, she said, her tone cutting through the tension.
This is my son, Miriam Cross. Oui, on a burst des tripes.
That's our vehicle. You can verify the plate, the registration, everything. He's done nothing wrong. Latimer didn't even glance at her, his eyes fixed on Elijah, unyielding. You have a problem with us doing our job, ma'am? I have a problem with assumptions, she fired back, her voice steady but sharp. You rolled in with 3 units because a man's taking something from his own trunk? That's not protocol, that's profiling. Moss shifted uneasily, his eyes darting to the passenger window, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. Can we get registration and insurance, please? It's in the glove box, Elijah answered, his voice calm but firm.
Ide préfet my mother get it, no sudden move.
Clean's voice dropped, low and threatening. We'll treat this like a felony stop if we have to. You don't have to. Miriam countered, moving to the passenger door with slow, deliberate steps, her eyes locked on the officers. You just don't want to admit you overreacted. She retrieved the documents, turned, and handed them over, her hand steady despite the rising tension. Moss took them quickly, skimming the information, while Latimer and Clean stood like statues, unmoved. They check out, Moss muttered under his breath. Clean grunted, dismissive.
Paperwork don't mean the Karen stolen.
He could have found it, you'd be amazed what these guys pull off.
These guys.
Elijah's voice cut through, his eyes locking onto Clean, steady and unyielding. Clean chewed slowly, his sneer unmistakable.
You heard me.
Miriam stepped forward, her voice colder now, a mother's fury rising. No, I don't think you understand who you're talking to. I understand exactly what I'm seeing. Clean snapped, his words dripping with contempt. Latimer, silent until now, spoke again, his tone flat but menacing. Sir, for our safety, we're going to ask you to kneel.
I want to do that.
Elijah said, his voice taut, resolute. I haven't committed a crime, and I won't be humiliated for your comfort.
You refuse à l'au fut l'ordre.
Latimer pressed, his hand inching toward his holster. That makes this a use-of-force situation.
No. Miriam's voice rang out, clear and defiant against the heavy stillness.
That makes it a power play. The canyon wind swirled around them, brushing past rocks and sage, a whispered warning that sent a chill down Elijah's spine. The silence that followed Miriam's words stretched long heavy, a veil draped over the gravel lot. Nothing moved, not the breeze, not the men, not even the sun, frozen in its descent. It was the kind of stillness that screamed of danger, the calm before a storm breaks. Elijah stood tall, unflinching, his face unreadable, no threat in his stance, but his refusal struck deeper than protocol. It was a refusal to bow, to submit. Clean's eyes twitched, Latimer's hand hovered lower on his holster, and then Miriam stepped forward, slow but fearless, her camera dangling from one hand, the strap tangled around her fingers. Her voice was calm, almost maternal, as she raised her free hand, placing herself between her son and the officers. Listen to me, she said, her words steady, piercing. This doesn't need to go further. You have the paperwork, the names, you have nothing to fear but being wrong. And that's not something you shoot over. Clean's mouth curled, his voice a snarl.
Ma'am, step back now.
I'm not letting you treat him like an animal just because you're scared of a black man standing tall, she declared, her eyes blazing. You don't get to turn fear into a weapon. As she stepped closer to Elijah, her camera swung, catching the sunlight, its metal glinting briefly, a fatal spark. "He's got a weapon," Clean shouted, his voice cracking in panic.
No.
Elijah roared, arms flaring to shield her, but it was too late. The gunshots erupted like thunder, two sharp, deafening bursts that tore through the canyon, scattering birds from the cliffs above. The silence that followed was crushing, a void that swallowed hope. Miriam's body jolted, twisting sideways as the bullet struck, her knees buckling before she hit the ground, her camera spinning from her grasp, shattering on the rocks beside her. Elijah lunged, catching her as she fell, her weight collapsing into his arms, her blood soaking his shirt, warm and relentless, like a river of grief. He held her close, his knees slamming into the gravel, his breath ragged, his eyes wide with stunned disbelief. Her chest was still, her lips silent, her warmth, his anchor, his light, fading into the dust. How could this happen?
Get on the ground. On behind your head, now.
Latimer barked, but Elijah didn't move, clutching her, his body a shield against a world gone mad. "I said now." Clean screamed, his gun still raised, his face twisted with fear and rage. A boot slammed into Elijah's ribs, forcing his grip to loosen. They dragged him from her, wrenching his arms behind his back, the zip ties cutting into his wrists, his shoulders popping under the strain, his face scraping the gravel, blood, hers, not his, staining his cheek. He didn't scream, didn't beg, but his eyes, locked on her lifeless form, never wavered. They shackled his ankles, called for an ambulance that arrived too late, its sirens a cruel mockery. Moss knelt beside Miriam, his face crumpling as the truth hit, turning away to retch behind the SUV, but it changed nothing. No one apologized. No one spoke her name. Latimer muttered into his radio, his voice cold, mechanical, "Suspect secure, one civilian down, non-compliant during lawful stop, officers discharged weapons fearing threat." No admission of error, no hint of remorse. The gravel seared Elijah's skin as they hauled him up, shoving him into the cruiser, his clothes stained, lips bloodied, wrists raw. His eyes stayed on the overlook on her, even as the doors slammed shut, the engine roaring to life. From the ridge, Ellison watched, unmoving, arms crossed, face blank, as if this tragedy was just another day. The wind swept through, kicking dust over Miriam's shattered camera, her blood soaking the gravel, the registration papers pinned beneath a heel forgotten. The gunfire's echo faded, leaving only silence, a silence that screamed of loss, of injustice, of a wound in Elijah Cross that would never heal. Cody Moss shifted uneasily, his eyes darting to the passenger side window of the black SUV, his nerves fraying like a worn rope. "Can we get registration and insurance, please?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant, as if he sensed the storm brewing. Elijah Cross stood tall, his posture calm but unyielding, his gaze steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "It's in the glove box," he answered, his tone even, deliberate.
Idée préfet my mother get it, no sudden move.
Why did it have to be like this? Clean's voice cut through, low and sharp, dripping with menace. "We'll treat this like a felony stop if we have to." Miriam Cross, standing protectively near her son, didn't flinch. "You don't have to," she said, her voice firm, her steps slow and visible as she moved to the passenger door, her eyes locked on the officers. "You just don't want to admit you're overreacting." She retrieved the documents with steady hands, turned, and handed them over, her gaze unwavering. Moss grabbed them quickly, skimming the information, his fingers trembling slightly, while Latimer and Clean stood like statues, their faces carved from stone. "They check out," Moss muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. Clean's response was a grunt, dismissive, cold.
Paperwork don't mean the car ain't stolen.
He could have found it. You'd be amazed what these guys pull off.
These guys.
Elijah's voice sliced through the air, his eyes locking onto Clean, burning with a quiet intensity that made the deputy pause.
Audare?
Clean chewed slowly, his sneer unmistakable, a challenge in his gaze.
You heard me. Miriam stepped forward, her voice now cold, a murderous fury rising like a tide.
"No, I don't think you understand who you're talking to," she declared, her words sharp, cutting through the heavy desert air. "I understand exactly what I'm seeing." Clean snapped, his contempt raw, unfiltered. Latimer, silent until now, finally spoke, his tone flat but laced with threat. "Sir, for our safety, we're going to ask you to kneel. Elijah's response was immediate, his voice taut, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. I won't do that, he said, resolute, unbowed. I haven't committed a crime, and I won't be humiliated for your comfort. Latimer's eyes narrowed, his hand inching toward his holster.
You refuses à la fut l'ordre?
That makes this a use-of-force situation.
Miriam's voice rang out, clear and defiant, shattering the oppressive stillness. No.
That makes it a power play. The canyon wind swirled around them, brushing past rocks and sagebrush, a whispered warning that sent chills racing down Elijah's spine. How could this moment feel so final? The silence that followed Miriam's words stretched long heavy, a veil draped over the gravel lot, suffocating in its intensity. Nothing moved, not the breeze, not the men, not even the sun, frozen in its slow descent, as if the world itself held its breath, bracing for the inevitable. It was the kind of stillness that screamed of danger, the calm before a storm breaks. Elijah stood tall, unflinching, his face unreadable, no threat in his stance, but his refusal struck deeper than protocol. It was a refusal to bow, to submit to injustice. Clean's eyes twitched, a flicker of unease betraying his bravado. Latimer's hand hovered lower on his holster, his fingers twitching, ready to act. Then Miriam stepped forward, slow but fearless, her camera dangling from one hand, the strap tangled around her fingers, her movements deliberate, unshaken. Her voice was calm, almost maternal, but it carried a weight that demanded attention. Listen to me, she said, her words piercing the tense air. This doesn't need to go further. You have the paperwork, the names. You have nothing to fear but being wrong. And that's not something you shoot over. Clean's mouth curled into a snarl, his voice harsh.
Ma'am, step back now.
I'm not letting you treat him like an animal just because you're scared of a black man standing tall, she declared, her eyes blazing with a mother's fierce love, her resolve unshakable. You don't get to turn fear into a weapon. As she stepped closer to Elijah, her camera swung gently, catching the sunlight, its metal body glinting briefly, a fatal spark in the wrong eyes. He's got a weapon. Clean shouted, his voice cracking with panic, raw and desperate.
No.
Elijah roared, his voice a thunderclap, arms flaring to shield his mother, but it was too late. The gunshots erupted like hammer strikes, two sharp, deafening bursts that tore through the canyon, scattering birds from the cliffs above, their cries echoing like a chorus of grief. The silence that followed was crushing, a void that swallowed hope, heavy with unbearable finality. How could this happen? Miriam's body jolted, twisting sideways as the bullet struck, her knees buckling before she hit the ground, her camera spinning from her grasp, shattering on the rocks beside her with a sickening crack. Elijah lunged forward, his heart pounding, catching her as she fell, her weight collapsing into his arms, her blood soaking his shirt, warm and relentless, a river of loss that stained his soul. He held her close, his knees slamming into the gravel, his breath ragged, his eyes wide with stunned disbelief. Her chest was still, her lips silent, her warmth, his anchor, his light, fading into the dust. Why her? Why now?
Get on the ground. On behind your head, now.
Latimer barked, his voice harsh, unyielding, but Elijah didn't move, clutching her tightly, his body a shield against a world gone mad, protecting her even now, long after the threat had passed. I said now. Clean screamed, his gun still raised, his face twisted with fear and rage, blotched red with the weight of his actions. A boot slammed into Elijah's ribs, a brutal blow that forced his grip to loosen, pain searing through him. They dragged him from her, wrenching his arms behind his back with such force that his shoulders popped, the zip ties cutting deep into his wrists, his face scraping the gravel, blood, hers, not his, staining his cheek. He didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't fight, but his eyes, locked on her lifeless form just feet away, never wavered. How could he look away? They shackled his ankles, the metal biting into his skin, and called for an ambulance, a cruel mockery, arriving 20 minutes too late, its sirens wailing in vain. Moss knelt beside Miriam, his face crumpling as the truth hit like a freight train, turning away to retch behind the SUV, his body shaking with the weight of what they'd done. But it changed nothing. No one apologized. No one spoke her name. Latimer muttered into his radio, his voice cold, mechanical, a chilling detachment. Suspect secure, one civilian down, non-compliant during lawful stop, officers discharged weapons fearing threat. No admission of error, no hint of remorse. A lie, cold and calculated, to bury the truth. The gravel seared Elijah's skin as they hauled him up, shoving him into the cruiser, his clothes stained with her blood, his lips bloodied, his wrists raw and throbbing. His eyes stayed fixed on the overlook on Miriam, her still form a wound in his heart, even as the doors slammed shut, the engine roaring to life, tearing him away from her. From the ridge above, Ranger Ellison watched, unmoving, arms crossed, his face a blank mask, as if this tragedy was just another day's work. The wind swept through, kicking dust over Miriam's shattered camera, her blood soaking the gravel, the registration papers pinned beneath a heel forgotten. The gunfire's echo faded, leaving only silence, a silence that screamed of loss, of injustice, of a wound in Elijah Cross that would never heal. The room they shoved Elijah Cross into was sterile, bare, a cold cage lit by harsh fluorescent lights that stripped the walls of color, banishing shadows. He sat alone at a metal table bolted to the floor, his wrists raw from the zip ties, now replaced with handcuffs that bit into his skin, his posture still, his gaze fixed forward, unblinking, a man carved from grief and resolve. Hours had passed, how many he couldn't say. Time had lost its shape, its meaning, somewhere between the blood-soaked gravel of Desert Viewpoint and this unmarked police station off Highway 89. Officers shuffled him in silence, their glances sharp, telling him without words that no truth would be found here, only a story already written to absolve them of their sin. Why wouldn't they listen? When the door creaked open for the first time, it wasn't an investigator who entered but a quiet man in a rumpled gray suit, fatigue etched into his face, a folder tucked under his arm. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer a shred of humanity, just sat across from Elijah, dropped the folder on the table with a thud, and studied him with a gaze that wasn't curious, only practiced, mechanical. "You can start by explaining what happened," he said, his eyes glued to the papers inside, as if Elijah's pain meant nothing. Elijah's voice was quiet, steady, a steel thread in the chaos. "You already know what happened." "I need it from you," the man pressed, his tone flat, indifferent. Elijah took a breath, not deep, not dramatic, just measured, holding back the storm. "My mother and I were on a road trip for her birthday. We stopped at Desert Viewpoint to stretch our legs, take pictures. I was getting the camera bag from the trunk when a park ranger radioed in a false report. Your officers arrived, escalated without cause. My mother tried to de-escalate, she was unarmed. They shot her." His words hung heavy, a truth too raw to ignore, but the man flipped through the file as if Elijah hadn't spoken, scribbling small notations in the margins, closing it with a snap before standing.
Oui, elle be back.
He wasn't, not that day. Elijah remained in that room, the hours folding into each other, a relentless blur of pain and silence. They brought him water without a word, a sandwich wrapped in plastic he didn't touch. How could he eat? No one asked questions. No one offered updates. Time crawled, wounded, dragging itself across the cold floor. He heard faint sounds beyond the walls, doors opening, boots on tile, muffled voices behind glass, but none were meant for him. By the time the first day passed, they moved him to a holding cell, no charges filed, no formal arrest record logged, just a digital trace of his name in a file marked pending review.
The co-wastin, une veine, the erriking of blichendol metal.
He slept in short bursts, more from instinct than exhaustion, his eyes snapping open with every clang beyond the bars, his mind replaying Miriam's fall, her blood, her silence. On the second day, someone came to take his fingerprints again, though they already had them. Why the pointless ritual? Another officer photographed him without explanation, the flash blinding, cold. They asked no new questions, offered no answers. No sign of action, no mention of Miriam's name, no reference to the tragedy that had shattered his world. The silence wasn't negligence, it was deliberate, a calculated effort to bury the truth, to let the crime fade into oblivion. How could they be so callous? When the 48th hour arrived, it came without fanfare, a uniformed officer appearing at his cell just after dawn, handing him a manila envelope with his wallet and keys inside, his voice flat as he said, "You're free to go." Elijah asked if his vehicle was intact. The officer said it was an impound, retrievable later that day. He asked where his mother was, his voice breaking on the words. "Coroner has her," the man said flatly, eyes never lifting, as if her life, her loss, meant nothing. Elijah didn't speak as they led him through a back corridor, out onto a cracked sidewalk behind the station, the morning wind tugging at his shirt, a cruel reminder that the world had moved on without him, without her. No one met him, no one offered a ride, no one explained why no one would be held accountable. His SUV, when he retrieved it, had been scrubbed clean, the blood gone, the seat sterile, the scent replaced by a chemical tang that burned his nostrils, a mockery of the life it once carried. The paperwork for its release was signed by a deputy he didn't know, a stranger in a story that wasn't theirs. He didn't ask questions. What was the point? He got in, adjusted the seat and drove, the road stretching hollow before him, Miriam's absence a weight in every breath, every mile, her memory a fire that would never fade. Elijah Cross didn't utter a word as they marched him through a dim back corridor, the cold fluorescent lights flickering overhead, casting harsh shadows on the cracked linoleum floor. His wrists ached, raw from the zip ties that had bound him, now replaced by the bite of metal handcuffs. They led him out onto a chipped sidewalk behind the station, the morning wind tugging at the hem of his blood-stained shirt, a cruel reminder that the world had kept spinning without him, without her. No one waited to meet him, no one offered a ride, no one dared to explain why no one would face justice for the life stolen from Miriam Cross. How could they just walk away from this? His SUV, when he retrieved it from the impound lot, was sterile, scrubbed clean of her presence. The blood gone, the seat polished to an unnatural sheen, the scent replaced by a chemical stench that burned his nostrils, a violation of the memories they'd shared in that car. The paperwork for its release bore the signature of a deputy he didn't know, a faceless stranger in a story that wasn't theirs. Elijah didn't bother asking questions. What was the point? He slid into the driver's seat, adjusted it with mechanical precision, and drove off, the road stretching before him like a hollow promise. The return home was a gut-wrenching void, Miriam's absence screaming in every corner of the house they'd once filled with laughter and love. Her scent, faint but unmistakable, lingered in the guest bedroom, where her suitcase sat open, half unpacked, a frozen moment of a life cut short. Her handwriting, elegant and patient, adorned a grocery list left near the fridge, a painful reminder of the mundane, beautiful life ripped away without cause, without apology, without consequence.
How could the world be so cruel?
2 days later, Elijah buried her beneath the shade of a wide, whispering oak at St. Luke's Memorial Cemetery, a place she'd chosen years ago, not out of fear but with a quiet belief in preparation, her strength shining even in the face of mortality. The funeral was small, intimate, no cameras flashing, no media circus, no spectacle to cheapen her memory. Just a handful of church friends, their faces etched with sorrow, and 2 former colleagues from the school where she'd taught for decades, their eyes heavy with unspoken grief. Elijah stood alone as the earth swallowed what remained of his mother, his heart a fortress of pain. The pastor's kind words, spoken gently, floated past him like leaves on the wind, offering no solace. The others tried to meet his gaze, to offer words that might soothe, justify, or share the crushing weight, but Elijah gave them nothing, no anger, no tears they could see. He was there to see it through, to honor her, not to be consoled. He didn't cry, not then, not there, under the watchful eyes of mourners. He saved his tears for later, when the last shovel of dirt was packed tight, the mourners gone, and the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the grave, indifferent to the dead. Why did it have to end like this? 3 days later, an envelope appeared beneath his front door, a silent intruder in the quiet of his grief. No return address, no markings, just a smooth white surface with his name scrawled in stark black print across the center, a mystery that sent a chill down his spine. Inside, a single USB flash drive gleamed, cold and unassuming, alongside a typed note that cut like a knife. They won't give you justice. This might. Elijah hesitated, his heart steady but heavy, his pulse eerily calm, as if his body knew what was coming. He crossed to his laptop, the weight of the moment pressing on his chest, inserted the drive, and clicked play on the lone video file.
Body cam footage flooded the screen, raw, unedited, the audio sharp and unforgiving. A brutal window into the truth.
Elijah's breath caught, his heart stilling as he watched the horror replay with agonizing clarity, the officers' panicked voices shouting conflicting orders, their words jagged with fear. Miriam stepped forward, slow and calm, her voice pleading for reason, a beacon of grace in the chaos. Her camera glinted briefly in the sunlight, mistaken in one catastrophic instant for something deadly. The gunshots exploded, sudden and brutally loud, a sound that shattered Elijah's world anew, her body collapsing into his desperate embrace, her life stolen in a heartbeat. How could they do this to her? The video pressed on merciless, capturing the officers' horrified realization, their whispered profanities, their frantic rationalizations as they scrambled to cover the mistake that had cost Miriam her life. Elijah watched until the screen went black, his fingers trembling, not from grief, not from rage, but from an aching clarity that settled deep in his bones, a truth too sharp to ignore. He rewound and played it again, forcing himself to absorb every excruciating detail, every panicked word spewed in the aftermath of the violence they'd unleashed so carelessly into his world. Why didn't they stop? Finally, Elijah closed the laptop, leaning back, his mind shifting, trained, disciplined, methodical, a Delta Force commander reawakened. A quiet resolve filled the silence, a fire kindled in the solitude of his home, beneath the shadows of what had been stolen. He understood with crystal clarity what needed to be done. Justice wouldn't come from courts, from investigations, from hollow apologies or empty promises of reform. Justice, for Miriam, would come from him alone, delivered swiftly, silently, with the precision that had defined his life. Was there any other way? Elijah Cross vanished into the night, a shadow slipping into the darkness, knowing exactly how this would end and who would pay for Miriam's life. The desert sky hung low, heavy, brushed with muted shades of twilight as he stood silently at the edge of the overlook where Miriam had drawn her last breath, the Grand Canyon stretching endlessly below, vast and indifferent, painted in purples and rusts by the fading light. The quiet wind whispered through sagebrush and dry grass, as if the world itself wanted to apologize for what had happened here, but Elijah found no comfort in its beauty, only a deep, aching emptiness that gripped his chest, sharpening a grief too raw to voice, too deep to escape. Why did this place feel so hollow now? He'd returned to the canyon only once, to ensure no trace of Miriam's memory remained lost in the gravel, no piece of her left behind. His eyes moved slowly across the ground, over stones carefully rearranged to hide the tragedy, the injustice. Now it looked pristine, untouched, as if Miriam Cross had never stood here, never laughed here, never lived here. But she had, and Elijah remembered every detail, the warmth of her laughter just moments before the violence, the grace in her voice as she tried to calm the officer's fear, the way her camera twisted in her hand as bullets tore through silence and flesh. How could he ever forget? He closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself one final moment to mourn, to feel the weight of her loss, before locking that pain away, a fuel for what lay ahead. When he opened them, his gaze was sharp, resolute, and he turned from the overlook, climbing into the waiting SUV with purpose. He drove back to his home one last time, knowing he'd never return, not as Elijah Cross, not openly, not until justice was served. At his house, he moved through the rooms with deliberate care, erasing every trace of himself, photographs of family vacations, letters filled with Miriam's wisdom, medals earned in silent service, all packed methodically into a metal footlocker, the only remnant of a life no longer possible. His digital trail was next. With the precision of a trained operative, Elijah wiped every footprint, bank records, email accounts, social media, even his veterans' benefits, leaving only empty accounts, ghostly echoes buried in databases, soon to be forgotten. By morning, Elijah Cross had ceased to exist, his identity dissolved into nothingness. Who was he now? 2 days later, he rented a small remote cabin deep in the hills near Flagstaff, far from prying eyes and questions he refused to answer. The cabin was sparse, barely furnished, chosen for its stark isolation, no comfort, no distractions, just a space to forge his mission. It became his command center, a base designed solely for the preparation of a task that demanded his entire being, every ounce of skill and patience honed in Delta Force. Here, Elijah resumed the grueling training that had defined his military life, intense regimens that hardened his muscles, sharpened his reflexes, pushed his limits. Each morning, he rose with the dawn, running through rugged terrain, his boots pounding the earth, climbing rocky ledges until his fingertips cracked and bled, driving his body to exhaustion only to repeat it the next day. Was this what it took to honor her? His evenings were spent under the stark glow of a single bulb, meticulously cleaning and inspecting weapons he had no intention of firing. His mission called for precision far more personal than bullets. Yet, Elijah knew the true battle was in his mind, in the information he needed to gather. Night after night, he reviewed the body cam footage that had appeared at his doorstep, raw and unedited, a brutal testament to the truth. This wasn't from some concerned civilian or sympathetic lawyer. It bore the marks of an insider, someone deep within law enforcement who'd risked everything to show him the unfiltered reality, someone who still believed justice mattered. How did they find the courage? Elijah played the footage hundreds of times, memorizing every detail, every gesture, every flicker of panic and guilt on the officers' faces, Latimer's cold detachment, Clean's aggressive sneer, Moss's hesitant fear. He learned their names, their habits, their schedules, the rhythm of their lives, his mission no rash outburst but a calculated, coldly precise pursuit of justice distilled to its core. Late one evening, as he planned with meticulous care, Elijah's attention snagged on a small telling detail in the footage, a moment near the end where another officer, visibly uneasy, stepped forward and muted his body cam. Elijah watched closely, noting the hesitation, the brief flash of regret in the man's eyes, and realized why this footage had reached him. Someone within their ranks, someone who'd seen the horror firsthand, couldn't stay silent, had chosen him to bear this truth, trusting him with a duty the system would never uphold. Why him? He isolated the man's face, storing the image securely, knowing this unknown officer could be useful, not an ally, but proof that even in a corrupt system, integrity could flicker, faint but alive. His training intensified, each exercise sharper, each movement deliberate, his reflexes honed to razor precision, scenarios rehearsed with brutal accuracy, his mind steeled for the confrontations he knew were coming. Weeks passed in quiet solitude, the cabin a hidden fortress, unnoticed by eyes that had stopped searching. The authorities had moved on, their statements polished, their lies delivered to an indifferent public, believing their silence was secure. But Elijah wouldn't let it stand.
Au coude.
Finally, one cold morning just before dawn, Elijah packed lightly and left the cabin, his body leaner, harder, every sense honed to a deadly edge. He left no trace, no fingerprints, no sign he'd ever been there. He slipped into the woods, vanishing into the shadows with effortless grace. Elijah Cross was no longer a retired soldier, a grieving son, or even a man in the world's eyes. He had become something else, a ghost made flesh, a whisper of justice, silent, cold, relentless, ready to deliver the reckoning Miriam deserved. Was this his destiny now? The pale moonlight slid silently across the cracked pavement, casting eerie shadows over the empty parking spaces surrounding the small ranger station just outside Grand Canyon National Park. The cool darkness stretched long and quiet, broken only by a single flickering security light that sputtered, struggling to pierce the night's veil. Elijah Cross waited in those shadows, still as a statue, his breath calm, rhythmic, a steady pulse in the silence. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, methodically traced every angle, every entry point, every vulnerability in the quiet building before him. His mind was a razor, honed to perfection, focused solely on the precise movements he'd rehearsed for weeks. Every detail meticulously calculated, every risk assessed and neutralized. There was no room for error here, and Elijah intended none. How could he falter when Miriam's memory burned so fiercely in his heart?
When the security camera lazily swiveled away from the side entrance, Elia moved, swift, soundless, a phantom in the night.
He crossed the empty lot in mere seconds, his steps fluid, practiced, a testament to years of Delta Force training. The electronic lock on the door was no match for his skill, yielding with a soft click under his determined hands. Inside, he paused in the dim hallway, his senses razor-sharp, listening for any sign of life, but only silence greeted him, a heavy, expectant hush. The station, as he'd predicted, was unmanned at this hour, its small staff long since tucked away in their beds, oblivious to the storm brewing in their midst. Moving with ghostly precision, Elijah slipped into the records room at the rear, his gloved hand sifting smoothly through drawers, folders and cabinets, extracting the personnel files, shift rotations, and daily reports that would lay bare Ranger Todd Ellison's every move. Why had this man set the wheels of tragedy in motion? Elijah worked with quiet efficiency, snapping photos of key documents with his phone, ensuring nothing was disturbed, a shadow that left no trace. Within minutes, he had what he needed, a clear map of Ellison's patrol routes, times and locations, a blueprint for justice. As swiftly as he'd entered, he glided out, leaving behind no evidence, no whisper of his presence, only the empty silence of a station unaware of its violation. Back at his secluded cabin, Elijah spread the stolen documents across a rough wooden table, the dim glow of a solitary lamp casting stark shadows over the pages. He studied each one with meticulous care, mapping Ellison's movements, committing every detail to memory, every trail, every hour, every habit. Ellison was predictable, routine-driven, complacent, a perfect target for Elijah's needs. He marked the ideal spot for their encounter, a secluded trail Ellison patrolled weekly, early in the morning.
NG, always alone.
Elijah planned with relentless precision, every possibility considered, every movement choreographed. Nothing would be left to chance. How could it, when Miriam's blood demanded retribution? 2 days later, beneath a quiet dawn, Ranger Todd Ellison hiked casually along his usual route, his boots crunching softly against dry earth and loose rock, the sound a faint echo in the vast canyon. Ellison, comfortable, unaware, paused now and then to admire the sweeping views, his mind adrift, utterly oblivious to the careful eyes watching him from the dense brush ahead. Elijah crouched motionless, his breathing steady, calm, his body poised like a coiled spring, every muscle primed for action. How could Ellison be so blind to the reckoning coming his way? As the ranger neared the narrowest point of the trail, flanked by a steep rocky drop-off, Elijah moved, silent, swift, a predator closing in. He covered the distance in seconds, a blur of purpose in the morning mist. Ellison barely registered the movement before Elijah was upon him, swift, silent, surgical. There was no time for the ranger to shout, no space to resist. Elijah's motions were controlled, purposeful, perfectly executed, a masterclass in precision born of years in the shadows of war. He delivered precise strikes, pressure points, nerve clusters, disabling any struggle instantly, his hands moving fluidly, powerful yet leaving no visible wounds, no evidence of the attack. Ellison staggered, his eyes wide with shock, comprehension dawning too late, a fleeting moment of terror as his balance faltered. Elijah held him steady for one final, agonizing second, just long enough for their gazes to lock, Ellison's fear meeting Elijah's cold, absolute truth.
Nos satisfactions, nos angers, juste the weight of justice in Elias unflinching star.
Why did you call in that report? Then with gentle finality, Elijah released him, stepping back silently as Ellison slipped over the edge, his descent swift, inevitable, vanishing soundlessly below the rocky ledge. The faint echo of Ellison's body striking the rocks below was muffled, distant, blending seamlessly with the canyon's whispering winds. Elijah stood at the edge, his heart steady, listening to the silence that returned, the canyon unchanged, indifferent to justice or tragedy alike. How could nature be so unmoved? Without haste, he erased the subtle signs of their struggle. Dust shifted, footprints brushed away with meticulous care. When he stepped back into the shadows, it was as if nothing had happened, the trail restored to its pristine emptiness, silent beneath the warming sun. Had justice truly begun? 2 days later, a news report flickered quietly onto local screens, a small story buried in the noise, easily overlooked by most. The headline read simply, "Local Ranger Dies in Freak Accident," followed by a brief account of Ellison's tragic fall during a routine morning patrol. Authorities noted no suspicious circumstances, offered no further investigation, closing the case with a quiet shrug. Elijah studied the article in silence, his face unreadable, feeling neither regret nor triumph, only the clear certainty of a step completed, a spark of justice kindled. He methodically packed away the stolen records, removing every trace of Ellison from his temporary headquarters, every piece of evidence destroyed, every memory erased with surgical precision. The mission was flawless, a perfect execution, but Elijah knew this was only the opening act of his campaign, a carefully planned, patiently executed pursuit of justice the law would never deliver. How could he stop now? There were still others whose actions had cost Miriam her life, and Elijah would find them, one by one, silent and precise, until the truth and its consequences could no longer be ignored. He pulled out the bodycam footage again, the raw, unedited truth that fueled his resolve, studying the officers' faces with cold intensity, Latimer's stoic mask, clean sneering defiance, Moss's hesitant guilt. He noted each name, memorizing their schedules, habits, routines, Deputy Ray Clean, Deputy Cody Moss, Trooper Brent Latimer. They were next. Elijah's mission had only begun, and he would remain invisible, relentless, unstoppable. Could they feel the shadow closing in? That evening, Elijah burned the last scraps of evidence in the cabin's small wood stove, watching the flames devour paper until only fine ashes remained, a symbolic cleansing of the past. He stood quietly at the window, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the trees, the weight of his path settling over him like a mantle. What had he become? He was no longer merely Elijah Cross, the grieving son, the retired soldier. He had transformed into justice itself, a shadow in the wilderness, silent, implacable, a force that would not be denied. As darkness wrapped the isolated cabin in its embrace, Elijah prepared for the next step of his methodical hunt, knowing there could be no turning back, no mercy, no hesitation. Justice was patient, precise, and Elijah had all the time in the world. Would they ever see him coming? Trooper Brent Latimer was unraveling, a haunted man trapped in his own mind. Sleep no longer offered refuge, only torment, replaying the scene at Desert Viewpoint over and over. The panic shouting, Miriam Cross stepping forward with calm grace, her camera glinting in the sunlight, and the deafening echo of gunshots that still reverberated in his skull. Why couldn't he escape it? In those sleepless nights, shadows crept along his bedroom walls, whispering accusations, every creak outside his window sending his heart racing with dread. The official reports had painted a clean picture, absolving him and his fellow officers, calling the shooting an unfortunate misunderstanding, but Brent knew the truth. He carried it silently, a weight that grew heavier with each passing day, crushing him from within. Every morning, he glanced nervously around, certain he was being watched, hunted by a ghost whose quiet rage lingered beyond that terrible day. On a gray Wednesday morning, as Brent shuffled sluggishly toward his kitchen, his eyes caught a package on his doorstep. No return address, no labels, just plain brown wrapping that felt sinister in its simplicity. What was this? He froze, his instincts screaming danger, but he couldn't leave it unopened, couldn't bear another second of uncertainty. With trembling fingers, he tore away the wrapping, his heart nearly stopping as he saw what lay inside. Miriam Cross's camera, its lens cracked, the strap twisted in the shape that haunted his nightmares. He recoiled as if burned, stumbling back, crashing into the table, a coffee mug shattering across the floor. This wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Elijah Cross hadn't vanished into oblivion. He was alive, aware, and coming for him. The paranoia that had nibbled at Brent's edges now consumed him whole. He withdrew obsessive, unable to trust even his closest colleagues, afraid to sleep, to step outside without a weapon.
Every shadowy da predator, every soundproof of intruder.
Desperation drove him to a fatal mistake. He fled, seeking refuge at a remote rest stop on a forgotten highway, believing isolation would shield him. How wrong he was. It was the perfect stage for Elijah's patient plan. Brent sat alone in his patrol car, the empty lot bathed in the cold glow of a flickering street lamp, his hands gripping the wheel, his breath heavy with panic he couldn't quell. The silence was deafening, broken only by a shadow at the edge of his vision, a quiet, deadly presence. Before Brent could react, the door was yanked open, a powerful hand seizing him, dragging him onto the asphalt in one fluid, unstoppable motion. Elijah Cross loomed over him, calm, precise, a figure of cold determination, his tactical gear blending with the night, his face half hidden beneath a hood, his eyes burning with restrained intensity. Brent gasped, struggling uselessly against Elijah's iron grip, his voice trembling as he stammered, "Please, Elijah."
Please, ouais, listen.
His words rasped, desperate, as he fought the hold pinning him to the ground. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen. I swear I tried." Elijah's voice cut through, calm yet edged with ice.
You did nothing. And you let it happen.
Brent's eyes widened in sheer panic, his heart pounding. "No, it wasn't like that. I was ordered not to intervene. I was told to stand down." Elijah's grip tightened, a chilling stillness taking hold.
Who? Brent shocked back a sob, fear spilling over.
"It came from above. The captain himself gave the order. He told us not to escalate, to write the reports his way, to stay silent. It wasn't my choice, Elijah. It was out of my control." Elijah's eyes narrowed, his face unreadable, but the weight of his judgment was palpable.
You were there. You saw it all.
You knew it was wrong, and you chose silence. Brent's pleas grew frantic, his voice CRA.
King with terror.
"They'd have destroyed me, Elijah. They'd bury me too if I spoke out. You know how it works, the chain of command, the system."
It wasn't personal.
Elijah's response was soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a verdict. "It was personal to me. And to my mother." Brent's shoulders slumped, defeated, his breath ragged, eyes brimming with helpless regret. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry."
Your apology change nothing.
Elijah said quietly, his voice steady, unyielding. He reached into his vest pocket, pulling out a small recording device, clicking it on with deliberate calm, holding it close to Brent's trembling face.
Tell the truth.
"All of it. Tell me about the order." Would Brent finally break? Brent Latimer's voice quivered, a broken whisper trembling in the cold night air, as he poured every detail into Elijah Cross's recorder, his words spilling out like a dam bursting under pressure. The exact instructions, the captain's sly, calculated manipulation, the explicit threats that loomed like a guillotine if anyone dared speak the truth about that fateful day at Desert Viewpoint. Every word rushed out, a torrent of long-buried guilt finally set free. How could he have stayed silent for so long? When Brent finished, his breath ragged, his eyes wet with shame, Elijah switched off the device with a deliberate click, slipping it back into his pocket, his face a mask of icy resolve. Without a word, he moved with ruthless precision, binding Brent's wrists and ankles with thick zip ties, the plastic biting into the trooper's skin as he left him sprawled on the cold pavement, gasping, his face pressed against the gritty asphalt. "Please."
Brent whispered, His voice a desperate plea, raw with fear. Don't leave me like this.
Elijah paused, his eyes steady, piercing through Brent's terrified gaze. My mother deserved more mercy than she got, he said, his voice low, cutting like a blade. You'll live with the knowledge that someone else paid for your silence. That's more mercy than you gave her. How could Brent face that truth? With a swift, clinical strike, Elijah rendered Brent unconscious, his body collapsing limp against the pavement, a silent testament to the justice Elijah was forging. Elijah stood slowly, casting one final glance at the fallen trooper, his heart steady, unyielding, before turning and vanishing into the darkness, as seamless as a shadow slipping through the night. Hours later, authorities found Brent bound, injured, unconscious, with no explanation, no evidence, no suspect to pin it on, just whispers of a ghost, a specter named Elijah Cross, who Brent now knew would haunt him forever. Elijah was out there, precise, patient, and far from finished. Who could stop him now? In silence and darkness, Elijah pressed forward, his mission burning in his veins, undeterred, his sights set on the next target, Deputy Ray Clean. Clean had chosen isolation, not as an escape but as a fortress, barricading himself in a remote cabin deep in the mountains, surrounded by dense pine forests, accessible only by a narrow, winding dirt road. His hideout stood alone, armed and defiant, with signs screaming private property, and threats against trespassers plastered across the perimeter. Floodlights pierced the night, motion sensors hummed, security cameras swept every approach, and inside, Clean kept an arsenal, rifles, shotguns, handguns, all meticulously maintained, loaded, waiting silently for the confrontation he'd begun to dread with every fiber of his being. Was he ready for what was coming? Word of Latimer's brutal encounter had spread like wildfire, quiet whispers echoing through station hallways, confirming Clean's worst fears. Elijah Cross was alive, methodical, a relentless force exacting justice on his own terms. Clean had fled soon after, abandoning any pretense of normal life, retreating into a defensive fortress, preparing for war against a ghost he could neither evade nor outwit. Paranoia had burrowed into his bones, a constant, draining companion, keeping him sleepless, vigilant, forever scanning the shadows, listening for the faintest sound. But Elijah? He was patient, tactical, relentless, qualities that now served him like a perfectly honed blade. Could Clean's defenses hold against such a foe? Elijah had studied Clean's movements with surgical precision, fully aware of the deputy's skill, knowing he'd offer the fiercest resistance yet. But Elijah was unshakably certain the showdown would end only one way. Days earlier, he'd slipped undetected to the edge of Clean's secluded property, a shadow among shadows, observing every detail, the layout, the routines, the nuances of Clean's defenses. Under cover of darkness, he moved silently, avoiding sensors, disabling cameras one by one with deft hands, cutting power to floodlights, leaving subtle, calculated weaknesses in Clean's fortress. He set traps of his own, simple, efficient snares and tripwires, not to kill but to incapacitate, tipping the scales permanently in his favor.
Why leave anything to chance?
Late in the evening, under a heavy sky cloaked in thick clouds that plunged the night into near pitch black, Elijah made his careful advance toward the cabin. He wove through the darkened woods with trained precision, his breathing steady, every step deliberate, every sense tuned to the slightest rustle or creak. As he neared the cabin, a pale flicker of lantern light revealed Clean's silhouette, pacing restlessly across the wooden floor, a weapon clutched tightly in his hand, his movements agitated, primed for battle. Had he sensed the storm approaching? Elijah slipped beneath a window, holding his breath, listening for a break in Clean's relentless pacing. A faint creak snapped his attention. Clean was moving toward the front door, wary, determined, as if instinct screamed that danger was near.
Elia pressed against the cabin wall, a silent predator waiting for the perfect moment aidé orchestrated.
The cabin door swung open with a harsh creak, Clean stepping onto the porch, shotgun raised, eyes darting across the shadowy terrain. Elijah remained utterly still, mere feet away, his heart slow, calm, methodical, a coiled spring ready to strike. Seconds stretched into an agonizing silence, neither man moving, both listening for the other's breath. Then, Elijah lunged from the shadows, seizing the shotgun barrel with blinding speed, wrenching it from Clean's grasp before he could fire. Clean snarled, reacting instantly, driving an elbow into Elijah's jaw, the blow sharp, jarring, blood filling Elijah's mouth as he staggered back. The fight exploded onto the porch, brutal, unrestrained, a clash of titans. Clean tackled Elijah against the cabin railing, wood cracking under the impact, sending them tumbling into the dirt below, grappling furiously, fists landing with vicious force, elbows striking flesh and bone, neither yielding an inch. How could it come to this? Elijah struck clean repeatedly, methodically targeting ribs, joints, anything vulnerable, his blows precise, relentless. Clean fought back savagely, his fists driving deep, clawing desperately for any advantage. Heavy and strong, Clean rolled atop Elijah, pinning him beneath his massive weight, his fists raining down mercilessly, one slamming brutally across Elijah's temple, sending bright spots of pain exploding behind his eyes. Elijah gritted his teeth through the blinding agony, fighting to regain control, driving a precise knee into Clean's ribs, forcing a harsh grunt as the deputy's breath was knocked out. They rolled apart, springing to their feet, blood streaming from cuts on their faces, eyes blazing with deadly resolve. Clean spat blood into the dirt, glaring murderously, hatred and fear mingling in his gaze. "You think killing me fixes anything, Cross?" he snarled, his voice raw with rage.
Your murderess not coming back, no matter how many body you leave behind.
Elijah's eyes narrowed, his voice low, icy. "This isn't about bringing her back. It's about ensuring you never bury the truth again." Could Clean understand the weight of his sins? Clean lunged again, his body crashing into Elijah, sending them both through the cabin door, splintering wood and glass scattering wildly. They hit the floor hard, rolling furiously, struggling for dominance, blows landing with savage force, no mercy offered or expected. Furniture shattered under their relentless violence, chairs splintering, a table collapsing beneath their desperate fight. Clean reached for a pistol, fingers closing around it in a frantic bid for control. Elijah reacted instantly, driving his knee into Clean's wrist, bones cracking audibly as the deputy screamed, the gun sliding uselessly across the floorboards. But Clean wasn't done, his eyes wild with fury, adrenaline masking his pain. He swung at Elijah's head, fingers curled like claws, aiming to gouge, to maim. Elijah blocked swiftly, countering with controlled precision, landing powerful blows to Clean's battered body, wearing down his fierce resistance. Clean staggered back, dazed, exhausted, barely able to raise his fists. Elijah advanced, methodical, every strike precise, devastating, driving Clean back until he collapsed, gasping raggedly, slumped against the cabin wall. Had Elijah broken him at last? Elijah loomed over him, breathing heavily but controlled, his eyes locked coldly on his defeated foe. He stood silent as Clean raised his head weakly, eyes blurred with blood and exhaustion. You have no idea." Clean gasped, his voice laced with desperate truth. "You don't know what really happened. It wasn't just us, it wasn't just about race." Elijah hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty in his steely gaze, his voice quiet but hard as iron. "Then tell me exactly what it was." Clean, broken and cornered, finally began to speak, his breathing ragged, desperate, yet his eyes still defiant despite his battered body slumped against the cabin wall. Elijah stood over him, chest heaving, sweat mixing with blood from a deep cut above his brow, his ribs aching from Clean's brutal blows. The fight had left them both raw, exhausted, teetering on collapse, but Elijah's gaze remained unwavering, focused solely on the deputy at his feet. Why did Clean still fight? Clean spat blood onto the floor, glaring up through swollen eyes, his face twisted with agony and hatred. Elijah stepped closer, grabbing him by the collar, lifting him partly upright, pressing him roughly against the wall. "You have something to say?" Elijah demanded, his voice sharp, dangerously calm despite the fire burning beneath it. "Speak clearly. Tell me why she had to die." Clean groaned, pain etched in every line of his face, but his mouth curled into a grim, bloodied smile, revealing broken teeth.
You're a chasing shadow, Cross. He rasped bitterly.
"You think this was about one bad stop, one scared cop? It wasn't. It's bigger, so much bigger." Elijah's grip tightened, forcing another groan from Clean. "Explain it. Now." Clean's eyes flickered with hesitation, fear creeping behind his bravado, each breath a struggle. Finally, desperation pushed him to the truth. "It wasn't random. We were ordered to make it go away. Your mother wasn't killed because of a camera. She was killed because someone powerful needed her out of the way. They knew who she was. They knew you'd be there." What did they know? Elijah's grip loosened slightly, shock rippling through him, though he quickly steeled himself. "Who ordered it?" he demanded, his voice harsh.
Give me a name.
Clean's jaw clenched, stubborn defiance flaring, but Elijah's fist drove into his stomach, doubling him over, stealing his breath. Clean slumped, choking, eyes wide with fear. "It came from inside," he gasped, pain lacing every word. "Way above our pay grade. You think we chose to cover this up? You think we had that power?" "Names." Elijah roared, his voice low, dangerous, fists clenched tight. "Now." What secrets was Clean hiding?
Captain Hargrove.
Clean hissed, the name slithering from his bloodied lips, crimson dripping down his chin like a confession torn from his soul. He was the one. He made sure no questions were asked, no evidence ever saw the light of day. He paid for silence, money, favors, anything to keep mouths shut. Elijah Cross's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint flashing in their depths, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. "Why would Hargrove target my mother?" he demanded, his voice low, a growl that trembled with barely contained rage. Clean's laugh was harsh, bitter, cut short by a painful cough that racked his broken body. She stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to see. She was never the target at first, but those pictures she took, evidence, something the captain needed buried deep.
Wrong place, wrong time, Cross.
They knew who you were. They couldn't risk you digging, so killing her was supposed to silence you, at least, that's what they thought. How could they be so ruthless? Elijah's pulse surged, a tidal wave of pain, anger, and betrayal crashing through him, his fingers trembling as the weight of Clean's revelation sank in. Miriam Cross hadn't been a random victim, caught in a moment of panic. She'd been hunted, her death a calculated murder, cloaked in the lie of a tragic accident. Clean's mouth twisted in agony, his eyes gleaming with bitter satisfaction as he watched the truth dawn across Elijah's face. "Now you get it," he muttered, his voice dripping with venom.
"You're chasing ghosts, Cross.
"You'll never get close. They'll kill you before you touch the truth." Elijah shook his head, his anger freezing into icy resolve, filling every corner of his heart with unyielding determination. "I've faced worse," he declared, his voice steady, defiant. Clean's bloody, broken smile taunted him. "You've faced nothing like this." Without warning, Clean lunged forward, desperation fueling his shattered body, smashing his forehead into Elijah's nose with explosive force. Elijah staggered back, vision blurring, searing pain flooding his senses, blood filling his mouth as Clean scrambled toward a fallen pistol across the floor. How could he still fight? Elijah recovered in a heartbeat, lunging with brutal force, crashing into Clean, knocking the gun away before it could be claimed. They grappled furiously, fists hammering into bruised flesh, bones cracking under savage blows, the room spinning in a violent whirlwind of their struggle. Furniture splintered under the force of their desperate clash, the cabin trembling with their rage. Elijah landed a precise, devastating strike beneath Clean's chin, snapping his head back, rendering him limp, unconscious, collapsing in a heap against the floorboards. Elijah stood over him, gasping, chest tight, blood streaming down his battered face, his body screaming with pain but his resolve unbroken. He knelt beside Clean's motionless form, checking his breathing, alive barely, but out cold, no longer a threat. Rising, Elijah moved swiftly to a hidden safe he'd spotted during their chaotic fight, forcing the lock with expert precision. Inside, a thick file awaited, its pages brimming with damning evidence. Payments, photos, proof of corruption, bribery, betrayal, a conspiracy far deeper than the cruelty at the canyon overlook. What had Miriam uncovered? Elijah turned back to Clean one final time, his gaze cold, devoid of satisfaction or remorse, only a quiet, unshakable resolution. Carefully, deliberately, he tucked the file under his arm, its weight more than paper. It was leverage, evidence, the key to dismantling the conspiracy that had stolen Miriam's life and truth. With heavy, purposeful steps, Elijah left Clean bound, broken, and unconscious on the cabin floor, slipping silently into the darkness, fully aware of the dangerous path ahead. How deep did this corruption run? As he vanished into the shadows beyond the isolated cabin, leaving behind the wreckage of their battle, Elijah knew his fight had grown far beyond vengeance. It was about exposing truth, uprooting corruption, delivering a reckoning long overdue. Cody Moss had unraveled in the weeks following Miriam's death, the relentless guilt a shadow he couldn't shake, clinging to him like a curse. Unlike his hardened colleagues, Cody lacked the steel to bury the truth deep within. It gnawed at him, robbing him of sleep, filling his nights with echoes of Miriam's calm, pleading voice, cut short by gunfire. Those memories were a torment, chasing him no matter where he fled, haunting every waking moment. Why couldn't he escape her face? He'd abandoned his apartment, cut ties with everyone he knew, drifting from motel to motel, paying cash, speaking only in whispers, desperate to vanish. Each new hideout offered only fleeting relief, the quiet hours quickly swallowed by regret, fear, and paranoia. He knew Elijah Cross was coming. It wasn't a question of if, but when. Tonight, Cody hid in a cheap roadside motel just outside a dusty Arizona town, pacing restlessly in the cramped room, shadows from the neon vacancy sign flickering across faded wallpaper like ghosts. A laptop sat open on a rickety table, a dozen tabs displaying news stories about Brent Latimer's mysterious assault and Ray Clean's brutal injuries, each headline tightening the knot in Cody's stomach, a grim reminder that his turn was near. How long could he run? A gentle knock at the door jolted him, his heart racing, adrenaline surging through his veins. He froze, holding his breath, the hammering in his chest drowning out all else.
Another knock, soft, steady, patient. Housekeeping. A bored female voice scaled through the door.
Cody exhaled shakily, feeling foolish, inching toward the door, opening it a crack, his mouth forming a dismissal when a powerful hand shoved it inward, throwing him back into the room. Before he could scream, Elijah Cross was inside, shutting the door with a swift click.
Pinning Cody against the wall with calm, military precision. Elia, please, ouais.
Cody pleaded, his voice frantic, struggling weakly against Elijah's iron grip, eyes wide with panic, surrender written in every tremble. Elijah's face showed no rage, no hatred, just cool, unyielding determination. "Stop resisting," he ordered, his voice firm, calm, commanding like a general on the battlefield. "Do exactly as I say, and you won't be harmed." Cody stilled, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts, nodding rapidly, fear raw in his eyes.
Whatever you want, please.
"I never wanted what happened that day, I swear."
Sit.
Elijah instructed, guiding Cody to a chair with controlled strength. Cody collapsed onto it, shaking, watching Elijah's every move with dread. Why was this happening to him? Elijah stood across from him, eyes hard yet composed, a quiet storm brewing beneath his calm. "I know you've been carrying guilt," he said softly. "I know it's eating you alive."
Cody's voice cracked, tears spilling over.
"You have no idea. It never stops.
Every night, every moment, is here."
I hear her voice. "I know I should have stopped it, done something, but I was scared, weak. I'm so sorry."
Sorry isn't enough.
Elijah replied, his tone cool but not cruel.
I'm not here to hurt you.
"You're going to help me make this right."
Cody swallowed hard, trembling incontrollably. Il el dos knitting. Please, forgive me.
Elijah's gaze softened, but his voice stayed firm. "Forgiveness isn't mine to give, but justice is still possible. You're going to upload the original body cam footage, the truth, unedited, anonymously for the world to see." Cody's face paled, fear flashing in his eyes. "They'll know it's me. They'll kill me."
No one will know.
Elijah assured him, his voice quiet but absolute. "Follow my instructions exactly, and you'll be safe." Cody nodded, wiping tears from his eyes. "All right."
Show me how.
Could he finally atone? Elijah moved with swift precision, guiding Cody's shaking hands through the process. The footage appeared on the laptop screen, raw, unfiltered, the undeniable truth of Miriam's final moments. Cody stared at the frozen frame of Miriam, standing calmly before her fall, grief etched into his features. "Send it." Elijah commanded, his voice steady, soft but unyielding.
Stay calm.
Cody exhaled shakily, obeying, uploading the file anonymously, watching the progress bar fill with agonizing slowness. When it completed, Elijah stepped back, satisfied. "It's done," Cody whispered, eyes downcast, his voice barely audible.
It's only the beginning.
Elijah replied, gathering the laptop swiftly. He turned to the door, pausing briefly.
Stay hidden.
"Stay quiet. And remember, your silence nearly buried the truth."
Don't let that happen again.
Was this Cody's chance at redemption? But suddenly, Cody lunged, a desperate act of fear, grabbing Elijah's shoulder with surprising force. Elijah reacted instantly, his training sharp, pivoting smoothly, seizing Cody's wrist, twisting it behind his back, pinning him face first onto the table with controlled power. "Please." Cody gasped, pain shooting through his wrist. I wasn't, I panicked. Stop. Elijah ordered, his voice deadly calm.
You're done fighting. Understand.
Cody nodded weakly, tears streaming down his cheeks. Elijah released him, stepping back carefully. Cody sank into the chair, defeated, ashamed, unable to meet Elijah's gaze. Elijah stood for a moment, breathing steadily, ignoring the sharp pain in his bruised ribs from the struggle. He looked at Cody, seeing his genuine remorse, his brokenness. You're the only one who can live with what you did. Elijah said quietly, without anger. Use it.
Remember it.
Change from it. Without another word, he slipped into the night, leaving Cody trembling alone in the empty motel room. The footage was out, visible to the world, justice advancing, truth breaking free.
Could the world ignore it now?
Outside, Elijah vanished into the shadows, feeling no triumph, only iron determination as he moved toward his mission's end. He knew his next target, Captain Hargrove, the man behind the cover-up, who thought himself untouchable. Elijah was ready, prepared, driven by the truth he carried, aware of the perilous road ahead. Nightfall in Washington, D.C., brought darkness not just to the streets but to the distant hills, where power and secrets hid behind gates and fences, cloaked in luxury and privilege. Elijah arrived silently, a phantom in the city, navigating its web of concealment with ease. His presence went unnoticed, unrecorded. He wasn't here as Elijah Cross but as a shadow, moving methodically toward a truth buried behind walls of deception. Would Hargrove ever see him coming? Hargrove's private cabin lay hidden deep in the woods, an hour from the city, at the end of a narrow, tree-lined road marked by private property signs, guarded by discreet cameras and sensors, a sanctuary for his dark dealings. It was a haven where corruption thrived, secrets stashed away from prying eyes. Elijah approached with ghostly silence, using the darkness as his ally, disabling the perimeter security with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, he breached the cabin's defenses, slipping through a side window, a whisper in the night. What would he find inside? Elijah Cross's gloved hands moved with smooth, deadly precision, gliding through desks, cabinets, and drawers in Captain Hargrove's secluded cabin, his search quick yet meticulous, every motion guided by an instinct honed through years of grueling training and a burning, patient thirst for vengeance. He knew exactly what he was after, his heart pounding with the weight of his mission. In a concealed cabinet tucked behind the desk, Elijah's breath caught as he uncovered a trove of secrets, encrypted flash drives, stacks of surveillance photos, documents stamped confidential, and printed records of wire transfers that reeked of corruption. A quiet dread coiled in his chest as he examined each item with care, his fingers steady but his mind racing. The photos and logs revealed prominent community figures, activists, lawyers, teachers, many black, all vocal critics of the privatized policing initiatives spreading like wildfire through vulnerable neighborhoods. Why were they targeted? Elijah's pulse quickened, a jolt of shock surging through him as he recognized Miriam Cross's face among them, her image circled in red ink, annotated with chilling precision, dates and times meticulously documented. How could this be? His heart thundered now, a drumbeat of fury and grief, as he rapidly decoded the flash drives, unveiling a sprawling surveillance database, a sinister catalog of detailed profiles, movements, and personal secrets of dozens of targeted individuals. Miriam's file was a gut punch, extensive and invasive, images of her at community meetings, screenshots of her social media posts railing against increased police presence, records of her conversations with local leaders opposing the city's shadowy privatized policing contracts. Miriam, a retired educator beloved in her community, had unknowingly become a mortal threat simply because she dared to document a truth far darker than mere corruption, a systematic, deliberate campaign to oppress communities of color, bankrolled by lucrative government contracts. Why hadn't she known the danger? Elijah's fingers tightened around the printed documents, a quiet fury building within him as the full scope of Miriam's discovery hit him like a freight train. Her camera, the very tool that had cost her life, had captured photographic evidence of a private police unit's brutal, illegal actions, sanctioned and hidden by Hargrove himself. She'd unwittingly recorded a savage beating and unlawful detention, an incident the authorities swore never happened. When Hargrove learned of her evidence, he'd ordered his men to erase it at any cost. Miriam's death was no accident, no fleeting mistake. She was deliberately silenced, her truth snuffed out without mercy. How could they be so cold? As Elijah frantically copied every piece of evidence, preserving the files and images with meticulous care, his fury burned quietly, tempered by a crystal-clear purpose. His mother hadn't died because of a deputy's fear. She'd been murdered on a direct order to bury a sprawling web of corruption that reached the highest echelons of law enforcement. The scale was staggering, a betrayal so vast it shook him to his core. Hargrove was just one cog in a ruthless machine, but his signature scrawled across payments, directives, and documents shielding private policing contractors from scrutiny screamed his guilt. Why had no one stopped this? His task nearly complete, Elijah froze at the distant crunch of tires on gravel. Hargrove had arrived early, unannounced. Without a hint of panic, Elijah melted into a shadowed corner of the cabin, his breathing steady, awaiting the captain's entry light. A predator poised to strike. Hargrove stepped through the door moments later, pausing as if sensing the air was wrong, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Before he could react, Elijah emerged from the shadows, moving with lethal precision, disarming Hargrove of the gun hidden beneath his jacket in one fluid motion. The captain stumbled back, eyes wide with raw fear and recognition, his bravado crumbling. "Cross," he stammered, hands rising slowly, his voice tense, clinging to a shred of authority.
You don't know what you're doing.
You can't grasp the scale of this. Quiet. Elijah cut him off, his voice soft but laced with cold resolve, a blade of truth slicing through the captain's lies.
You know everything.
Miriam Cross died because she threatened your schemes, because she took pictures you couldn't let see the light. You ordered her death. Hargrove's jaw tightened, defiance flaring briefly before collapsing under the weight of his fear. It wasn't personal, Cross, he protested, his voice cracking. It was business, bigger than you or me. Private policing keeps things profitable, efficient. If her evidence got out, it would have ruined everything. My mother was killed to protect your profits.
Elia shot back, his voice ici, dangereux liquier, every word à condemnation.
You sold entire communities to the highest bidder. You turned peace into a commodity and justice into a joke. Hargrove retreated, panic rising in his eyes, his composure unraveling. You can't stop it, he muttered, his voice trembling.
You won't survive if you expose it.
Neither will you. Elijah replied, his tone devoid of anger, unwavering, absolute. You destroyed lives for money, but now the truth is out. Before Hargrove could muster another word, Elijah struck, a single decisive blow, swift and precise, leaving the captain unconscious on the cabin floor, breathing but helpless, no longer a threat. How could such a man wield so much power? Elijah moved quickly, clutching the copied evidence with care, knowing exactly what must follow. He slipped out into the night, vanishing into the darkness with the grace of a phantom, heading toward the city, the truth securely in his grasp, ready to be unleashed where it could no longer be ignored. He carried proof, not just of Miriam's innocence but of a sprawling conspiracy of greed, violence, and corruption that had systematically crushed vulnerable communities, shielded and funded by men like Hargrove. Justice would no longer whisper, it would roar. Elijah knew, as he pressed onward with steely determination, that the truth Miriam died for would finally blaze into the light. He had everything he needed now, the corrupt network would face its reckoning. Could they hide any longer? Elijah Cross wasn't fighting for personal vengeance anymore. His mission had grown into something far greater, a truth powerful enough to topple a system rooted in cruelty, corruption, and exploitation. Now at last, justice was marching toward daylight, unstoppable. Morning broke over Washington, D.C., with a deceptive calm, the soft hues of dawn masking the tempest about to engulf the nation. Elijah had returned, silent, anonymous, unseen, but his presence rippled through the city like a shockwave. Within hours of his quiet exit from Hargrove's cabin, the world awoke to a storm it couldn't ignore. Anonymous uploads flooded news channels, social media, and investigative forums, raw, unedited bodycam footage of Miriam Cross's shooting, searing across screens, horrifying millions who watched a peaceful woman plead for reason, only to be cut down in a blur of gunfire born from panic and prejudice. How could such a tragedy be buried? But Miriam's death wasn't the only revelation that shook the public. Soon after, another anonymous upload followed, this time the trembling confessions of Trooper Brent Latimer and Deputy Ray Clean, captured in Elijah's precise recordings, their voices heavy with fear and regret, admitting to pressure from above, deliberate orders to cover up evidence, and calculated efforts to silence questions about Miriam's killing.
The nation reeled, outraginiting like wildfire.
Communities mobilized, protests erupting in cities and towns, a chorus of voices demanding accountability, calling for immediate investigations. Journalists, activists, and everyday citizens roared for answers, not just for Miriam but for countless others crushed by a corrupt system that had operated unchecked for too long. Who could stand by and let this continue? Among the watchers was Cody Moss, alone terrified, but now fueled by a resolve he'd never known. The guilt that had consumed him had morphed into a burning need to act, to do what he'd lacked the courage for before. He watched the videos spread, saw the public's fury, and knew his silence was no longer bearable, his complicity a stain he couldn't ignore. Elijah had spared him, given him a shot at redemption. How could he waste it? Late that night, Cody, hands trembling but heart resolute, uploaded the files Elijah had entrusted to him. Files exposing Captain Hargrove's direct role in the private policing initiative, the orders to target Miriam, and money trails linking him to contracts policing black communities. Cody ensured every detail was anonymized, crystal clear, a beacon of truth. Stepping back from the computer, he breathed heavily, knowing he'd just lit a fuse that couldn't be snuffed out. Had he finally done right? Within hours, the documents exploded across the nation, splashed on every screen. Hargrove's corruption, his role in silencing activists, was undeniable, the public's outcry a deafening roar demanding justice for those betrayed by their protectors. Hargrove was suspended, then arrested, his smug facade crumbling under the weight of irrefutable evidence. For the first time in weeks, Cody wept openly, not from fear but from relief, a sense of justice moving forward at last. He knew the danger he faced, but his conscience was clear. Could he ever repay Miriam's sacrifice? Meanwhile, Elijah watched from the shadows, monitoring the conspiracy's rapid unraveling, his heart steady but heavy. He hadn't come this far for vengeance alone. It was about truth, now blazing in the open, demanding to be heard. His role had been silent, relentless, but now others carried the torch. Journalists, activists, whistleblowers, and ordinary people empowered by the truth. News coverage surged, detailing how privatized policing had exploited vulnerable neighborhoods, targeting communities of color under Hargrove's corrupt reign. Official inquiries, federal investigations, and calls for reform erupted, politicians scrambling, executives facing charges, suppressed stories finally breaking free. Elijah knew this was Miriam's legacy. She'd risked everything to expose this. Pride mingled with grief as he realized she'd given her life for justice, not just for herself but for thousands suffering under a system of greed and cruelty. How could her courage be so vast? Still unseen, Elijah moved through crowded streets where marchers waved banners demanding justice, dignity, accountability, their chants echoing Miriam's name with reverence. He felt a warmth, seeing her heroism celebrated, her courage outliving her. The revelations were unprecedented, undeniable, impossible to silence. Within days, Hargrove's network faced ruin, charges filed, hearings set, careers shattered, reputations in ashes. Yet Elijah knew this was just the start. Dismantling such a system demanded relentless vigilance, unyielding truth. Was this the dawn of real change? Elijah Cross stood at a quiet distance, his heart heavy yet resolute, watching the world awaken to the truth he'd fought so hard to unveil. The mission was no longer his alone. How could it be? It now belonged to everyone, a shared battle fueled by the courage of a nation stirred from its slumber. He'd done exactly what he'd vowed to achieve, delivered the justice Miriam Cross deserved, ripped the veil off a truth so deeply buried it had nearly vanished forever, and exposed a corruption so vile it shook the foundations of power. As the sun dipped low over Washington, D.C., painting the sky in fiery hues, Elijah stepped back from the chaos he'd quietly ignited, his soul certain that his fight had reached its peak. The battle wasn't his anymore. It belonged to a nation empowered by truth, seething with anger, aching with grief, and burning with hope. Could there be a greater legacy? He'd set justice in motion, a force now irreversible, unstoppable, a tidal wave crashing through the lies. Elijah no longer needed violence or vengeance. Why would he? The nation's voice roared louder, clearer, more powerful than any single man's actions could ever be. And now, with a heart both heavy and free, Elijah silently withdrew, slipping back into the anonymity from which he'd emerged, a shadow fading into the twilight. His work was done, but the story, the fight for